This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, can I welcome you all to the last of the Dean Seminars for calendar year 2011. My name is Roger Kane, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the Dean of the School of Advanced Study, and it's a real pleasure to have as our speaker this evening Professor Andrew Hussey, who is my fellow Dean of the University of London's Institute in Paris. We in the School of Advanced Study, and I know also Andrew and colleagues in ULIP, are very keen to see much more collaborative working between the two organisations than has perhaps happened in the past. And I suppose very symbolic of that is the Dean of ULIP speaking in the Dean of SAS's seminar series. So Andrew, you are hugely welcome. As soon as Andrew starts talking, you will realise that he is a Liverpudlian by birth. He studied at Manchester and Lyon. He taught at Manchester and Dijon and Barcelona, and he was then senior lecturer in French at Aberystwyth, from where he moved, I believe, to become the Dean of the University of London Institute in Paris. He's written, as one might expect, a number of books, very many articles. Some of his books, especially on Paris and on North Africa, have been extraordinarily well received. They've won prizes, they've been nominated for highly prestigious awards, and all of that, I think, culminated in Andrew's being admitted to the Order of the British Empire in the New Year's Honours List this year, in 2011. The citation reads, "For services to UK-France relations." Today he's going to be talking about France in a wider context, I think, than metropolitan France, but to talk about the Francosphere and particularly focusing on some of the work that he's been doing very recently on North Africa in Algiers. So Andrew, please, if you would.
Well, thanks very much. The first thing I want to say is very briefly, thanks to Professor Kane for inviting me here. And I won't dwell on this, but I think it's important that ULIP is close to people in Senate House, because we're all part of the same project. And I'm very happy that these synergies are drawing together, and I like to think that today's paper is just part of that ongoing beautiful friendship, as Humphrey Bogart might have put it in Casablanca. So the wars of Algiers, culture, conflict and politics in the 21st century French and Algerian imagination. Well, before I begin the actual paper, I'd like to actually set the paper in its real context, or rather into two separate but related contexts. And the first context is that of the University of London Institute in Paris, or ULIP, or ULIP as they call it in Paris, where I've been Dean for the past 5 years, and where my research is actually being developed on the ground, so to speak. And the importance of this point about research is that ULIP is actually unique in the UK HE system, because it's the only part of that system which is entirely based outside the UK as a fully autonomous academic unit. The important thing is that ULIP's not a franchise, but a fully functioning component part of the University of London, in fact. So there's a lot I could say about this as a manager, about the challenges that this means for staffing, students, recruitment, degree delivery, and so on. But this evening, what I really want to focus on is research, and the crucial fact of how being based in Paris, in France, in Europe, has impacted on my research, in the sense that we're functioning within a portal to the wider French-speaking world, which we might term at this early stage the Francosphere. And this brings me to the second point. I'm not only Dean of ULIP, but, an active researcher in the field of French studies, a quickly mutating field, as it were. And perhaps I should explain here that my research interests have always been linked by one big single idea, which is the notion of extremism in French culture. Or if you like, the mysterious link in French history between intellectual violence and real violence. I think this is one of the characteristics of French history that is still actually to be unravelled and explained by British and French historians. And as we know, the Great Revolution of 1789 is only the most well-known and visible manifestation of this tendency. But all of my work, my books on the mystic, surrealist, pornographer Georges Bataille, the anarchist, terrorist Guy Debord, even the history of Paris, which I read through the prism of Louis Chevalier's work on the classe dangereuse, they all flow out of this deep cultural seam, or at least I like to think so. So what I want to do in terms of research this evening, or research activity, is to present a snapshot of my current work in progress, and then to throw open, based on this work, some debates, some questions, some issues about the current state of French studies in Britain. More to the point, where I'm going with this, what I'd really like to indicate is that contrary to the widely perceived belief that French studies is an elitist discipline doomed for extinction within a generation, I think it's even more vital than ever for us to engage with the French-speaking world from the point of view of the Anglo-American Academy. And this in fact is the guiding rationale, I said that with a French accent, didn't I? Rationale of the journal, the journal Francospheres, which we'll be launching at ULIP next year. And my real point here, and this is what I want to sort of, unpack in this paper, as it were, is how both for students and especially for researchers, the fact of living and studying in the very object of your research, the capital of the Francosphere, must have a crucial and determining impact on their activity. To be more specific, where I am right now is I'm writing a book called The French Intifada, which is a study of France and North Africa, past and present. And it's a study which takes various forms. It's partly travelogue, it's partly reportage, it's partly oral histories and interviews, and it's also history. And where I want to go today is some theoretical observations on the way French historians think about their history. But what I kind of want to open up with this paper, as I suggested before, is how when you're writing this kind of work, you're writing from a kind of dual perspective. You're both inside and outside the object of research. So the metaphor of the wall, which has, obviously two sides, is very important for me. And this is why this paper is called The Walls of Algiers. Because walls, prisons, barriers and borders are kind of the way I define this notion of the Francosphere. But actually, I'll start the paper now, actually. And let you know that where I'm really going with this is that this is part of a section of the book which I've just finished, which is called Prisoners of Love, Algeria. Now, Prisoners of Love sounds like a dodgy 1980s album, and it could, kind of the title of that kind of thing. But actually, where I've stolen the title from is from Jean Genet's book Captif Amoureux, which I think is one of the most difficult and complex and paradoxical books that he wrote. And as we know, he wrote it in the 1980s in Beirut, when he was, he was commissioned by Yasser Arafat to work with the Fedayeen and Palestinian organisations in that period. So this section, Prisoners of Love, is about the paradoxes, the psychoanalytical issues of what it means to be Algerian, what it means to be French in the 21st century. And I'm going to start off with some images, and I'll explain these images. The first image, I'm sure you're familiar with, is Pepe le Moko at the end of the great classic 1937 film, Pepe le Moko. The story of a French gangster imprisoned within the Casbah of Algiers, and this final scene is just before Pepe's suicide as his lover Gadi sails for France. And I'll come back to this very famous image shortly. But it's an image that's lodged deep in French cultural memory. This second image is slightly more arcane, but it has an importance in the 19th century imagining of Algeria from France. This is a comic character called Cagaïus, who's supposed to be the pied noir, the working class European native of the district of Bab el-Oued in Algiers. Deeply anti-Semitic figure, capturing much of the tensions of the period. But to Parisians, Camus would be known as the archetypal working class Algerian. And the language is very interesting in these journals. Camus comes to Paris in 1899 at the time of the Great Exposition. And Parisians said, who are you? What are you? What language are you speaking? And he goes, Algériens, nous sommes été. You know, we're Algerians, and so what? Very interesting. This third image is from 1969. And this is from a brief moment when Algeria was set to become the countercultural capital of the Third World. This is when the great Pan-African Festival was held in Algiers. And amongst the visitors were the Black Panthers, Timothy Leary, Archie Shepp, and this African-American centre is on the Rue des Lys in the centre of Algiers. Now, very quickly, all of this disappeared from Algerian discourse. It was a very interesting moment in post-war, post-independence, where Algeria is set to be the radical chic leader of the world. So we've got these three images, which each tell a different story about how Europeans, about how the French, about Americans, how Americans imagine Algeria. Now, slightly ambitiously, I'm going to show two film clips that I'm going to base the rest of the paper on. And the first clip is from Pepe le Mocco, one of the opening scenes where the police in Algiers are working out how they can get hold of Pepe le Mocco. He's gone underground in the Casbah and he can't be found. And this is a very interesting representation of the Casbah. Let me just show this.
Bonjour patron, je vous présente notre collègue de Paris, l'inspecteur Franquier. Enchanté, je le connaissais. Continuez. Essayez d'expliquer à notre collègue les raisons de notre échec dans l'affaire de Pépé de Coco. Il n'y a qu'une raison. Et il échappe à vous sur le pavé. La Casbah. C'est ce que je disais. J'irai faire un tour de bain pour y voir clair. Pour y voir clair, c'est amusant. Mais la Casbah, c'est un maquis. Ce n'est pas mon cher collègue. Oui, on peut dire que Pépé tient le maquis. Et la bonne oiseau, le quartier d'Alger qu'on appelle la Casbah, profond comme une forêt, bruyant comme une fourmilière, est un vaste escalier dont chaque terrasse est une marche et qui descend vers la mer. Entre ces marches, des ruelles tortueuses et sombres, des ruelles en forme de guet-apens, des ruelles qui se croisent, se chevauchent, s'enlacent, se désenlacent dans un fluide labyrinthe. Les unes étroites comme des couloirs, les autres voûtées comme des caves. De tous côtés, dans tous les sens, des escaliers, des montées abruptes comme des échelles, et descendent vers des gouffres sombres et clants. Des porches suintants, envahis de vermine et d'humidité. Des cafés obscurs, fondés à toute heure. Des rues désertes qui habitent le silence, des rues aux longs écrans. Ce sont 40 000, là où il ne devrait être que 10 000. 40 000 venus de partout. Ceux d'avant la conquête, ceux passés par paresse, et leurs descendants honnêtes, traditionnalistes, et pour nous, mystérieux. Les Kabyles, les Chinois, les Gitanes, les Aémanos, les Slaves, les Maltais, les Nègres, les Siciliens, les Espagnols, et des filles de tous les pays, de tous les formats, des grandes, des grosses, des petites, des sans âge, des sans forme, la mine de Grèce où nul n'ose se risquer. Les maisons comportent des cours intérieures, isolées comme des cellules sans plafond et sonores comme des puits, communiquent presque tous entre elles par des terrasses qui les dominent. Ces terrasses sont le domaine exclusif des femmes indigènes. En fait, l'Européen, il est cependant toléré. Elles forment une ville à part, et de marche en marche, descendent ainsi jusqu'à la mer. Colorées, vivantes, multiples, hurlantes. Il n'y a pas une Casbah, il y en a 100. Il y en a 1000. Dans ce dédale, dans ce grouillement, Pépé est chez lui. Et pour l'arrêter, il ne suffit pas de se lever de bonheur. Et il est bien gardé, hein. Il a pas vent. Là-haut, tout à fait gré complice. Les nouvelles files de terrasse en terrasse.
Okay, so that's 1937, it's Casbah. It's a great place to kind of fancy Casbah. This is bang up to date. This is a film from 2008 called DS Polymer. I'm just going to show the trailer for it to give you a flavour of what that same city might look like in the Algerian imagination. Some 50 years on. This is about 2 minutes long.
Mais oui, quand il est débarrassez-moi de ce mari, je pense.
Ne vous inquiétez pas, on va s'occuper de lui. C'était ça mes affaires. Provoquer le petit coup de pouce que le destin tardait à donner.
Absolument pas. Monsieur Ménil, je suis l'avocat de votre femme. On s'est adultère.
Je me battais pour réaliser mon rêve. Les termes d'Algérien. Je pouvais les racheter pour une bouchée de pain.
Et vous allez m'appeler comment alors? Mais pourquoi c'est votre fils, madame Algérienne?
C'est quoi ton rêve?
Ah, mon rêve, c'est la danse. C'est quoi au juste ce boulot?
On fait un peu de tout.
T'as qu'à me dire la vérité, c'est tout.
Vous faites pas l'escorte? Je suis pas de ce genre.
Si tu veux, je t'emmène en Italie.
Je ne veux pas que tu me quittes.
On va tous changer.
Mais pour qui je fais tout ça? Pour toi, pour Riyad, pour Nina, pour moi? Encore 2 ou 3 affaires, c'est fini. Ne t'inquiète pas, ça va bien se passer.
Mais oui, car il est si. Je pense à toi, Panama.
Les clients ont toujours raison. Et les plus tard ont toujours tort.
Le délice Paloma.
Je peux pas la voir sensible à une vieille putain comme vous. Pas vieille. Juste putain.
Pas vieille, juste putain. This is where I'm going to start the paper, properly as it were. One of the best films set in Algeria in recent years is not about war, politics or terrorism, but it's the sophisticated and bittersweet comedy called DS Polymer that we've just seen the trailer for. It stars the Algier-born actress and singer Biouna as an ageing prostitute who runs a variety of scams in the city. Witty, fast-paced and sexy, with a scabrous view of the Algiers underground scene, this film's got more in common with the films of Pedro Almodovar than Gillo Pontecorvo's classic, but I think rather dated and dour, account of the Algerian War of Independence, the Battle of Algiers, which is until now, I think, probably the best-known film about Algeria outside France and North Africa. But although it's a comedy, DS Polymer is laced with sadness. The most powerful scene is at the end, as Madame Algeria, that's the figure we've just seen, sits outside a seedy nightclub, swigging bottles of beer with a male friend, a pimp, both of them ruminating on life's disappointments. She recalls her time in prison, all the working girls she's met who've been kicked out of France, Spain, Italy, even Iran and Egypt. But Madame Algeria, says her companion, do you know anywhere in the world that likes Algerians? Of course not, she replies. It's like that song by Claude Claude, Le Mal-Aimé, the unloved. We are always the Mal-Aimé. Now, I think this is a poignant and arresting moment of cross-cultural traffic. Of course, with their French cultural heritage, Algerians know of and identify with the schmaltzy French singer Claude Claude, the nickname of the 1970s variety singer Claude François. But the real point is that Madame Algeria confesses with a sigh. These days the French and the wider world seem to know little of Algeria and in fact care even less. This scene ends with the old whore throwing bottles of beer at a passing taxi cab before staggering off into the night. You could say that this seems an apt metaphor, actually, for the rage that Algerians often feel towards the world, and France in particular. At the midpoint of the 20th century, the Algerian War of Independence, fought by Algerian nationalists against the occupying French authorities, held the attention of the world. This was the most vicious of all wars of decolonisation, with no quarter given on either side. And its outcome, it was argued at the time, would determine the rest of world history. Let's not forget it was a Frenchman, the economist Alfred Sauvy, who coined the term Third World in 1952, to describe the countries who, as they emerged from the colonial governments, did not align themselves with either side in the Cold War. Like the Third Estate during the French Revolution, they would claim their own place in the world. And throughout the 1960s, this very tiers-mondisme, as it was called, became a kind of safe haven for many French intellectuals who felt stifled by the constraints of classical Marxism. Algeria, for the so-called Pieds Rouges, the French who came back to Algeria after the Declaration of Independence. Algeria would lead the way. But this is not what happened. The Algeria that emerged from the war and from the French occupation was poor and psychologically damaged. Instead of following a policy of third world leadership, in fact, the country sought to heal itself with a retour aux sources, a return to the sources. This meant, after 1965, effectively an Arabization of culture, accompanied by a resurgence of Islam, or varieties of Islam, as the arbiter of the non-European values of the new Algeria. Western intellectuals during this period slowly deserted Algeria, or in fact found themselves in Algerian jails. And the country quietly slipped back into its role as a backwater in the Arab world and elsewhere. I'm continuing the background now. History returned with a cruel vengeance in 1992. This is when the army took control of the country in the wake of the elections, which had apparently been won by the Front Islamique du Salut, the Islamic Party of Salvation, or the FIS. The FIS had vowed to lead Algeria into an Islamic revolution on the Iranian model. This was clearly unacceptable to Western governments and the oil men in the south of the country, as well as the stagnating but still deadly remnants of the government who had taken Algeria to independence. As the elections were cancelled, the hard men of the FIS took to the mountains. Ordinary people blamed the French once again for stifling their voices, and the second Algerian civil war had begun. Nobody knows how many people died during the 1990s, although sensible estimates are never much short of 200,000. Nobody knows how much of the violence was orchestrated by the government to terrify the population into giving them support. But a flavour of the viciousness of the violence is contained not in the figures, but in the details. These include, for example, a primary school teacher who was raped outside her humble classroom in a village outside Oran. She was then beheaded in front of her class, all of whom were under the age of 10, and her severed head placed on the desk at the front of the class as a warning. This is not warfare, I would suggest, but psychosis. Well, how to explain this? As I'm sure you're aware, the supreme theoretician of the first Algerian War of Independence was Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist from Martinique who detested French colonialism and who worked for the Algerian side until his death in 1961. According to Fanon, who wrote piercing and angry books on the subject, much admired by Jean-Paul Sartre, amongst others, colonialism was a form of psychic violence which destroyed the identity of the colonised. As a response to this, Fanon advocated total rejection of European civilization. And by this, Fanon meant the creation of a new culture defined by force of arms if necessary. He called this la volonté d'être nègre, the will, difficult word to translate, to be a Negro. A Negro in every sense, in the sense of being outside white European culture. Well, actually, I think Fanon was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about this. He was right about the devastating psychological effects of colonialism, even if the means of resistance, as I've just suggested, are arguably just as destructive. But one of the questions that I still haven't solved, but which still fascinates me, is the nature of the relationship between France and Algeria. And I would argue that the origins of the trauma, the Algerian trauma, which is the origins of what I just called before psychosis, are particularly unusual in that there's always been a long historical complicity and intimacy between France and Algeria, which is never straightforward, and it's certainly never as straightforward as the binary relationship between colonizer and colonized, which is one of the staples of recent post-colonial theory. My view is that rather than the question of Algerian, my view is that the question of Algerian identity for Muslim and non-Muslim is actually fraught with double binds and contradictions, which ultimately owe more to psychoanalysis, going back to Fanon, than they do to politics. Probably the most famous Algerian-born writer in the 20th century has to be Albert Camus. And arguably most people who know anything about Algeria, in French studies or anywhere, have approached Algeria through Camus. Camus is interesting, still. To the extent that all of his thought is sourced and marked by his experiences in Algeria. It's no accident that L'Étranger, the classic account of the alienated mind, takes place in Algeria in the late 30s. And it's no accident, in my view, that its central motif is the pointless shooting of an Arab by its icy narrator, Meursault. One of the most chilling scenes in the book, I think, is when Meursault is thrown into a prison cell packed with Muslims, and he's asked by one of them what he's done. "I killed an Arab," he says. Well, like most Europeans or Americans of my generation, as I said before, I first came across Algiers and Algeria in Camus' writings, not just in L'Étranger, in fact, but also his memoirs and essays. And like most readers then and now who approach Algeria through the prism of Camus, I was puzzled by this place, which, as he described it, was so French that it might have been in France. It was also so far, so foreign and out of reach. I see now that part of this difficulty arises from the fact that the Algeria Camus describes is only partly a Muslim country. In fact, Camus sees Algeria, this is his vision of Algeria, as an idealised pan-Mediterranean civilization. And in all of his autobiographicals in Algeria, Algiers, the Roman ruins of Tipasa, what he admires, what he fantasises about, is a pagan place where classical values are still alive and visible in the harsh but beautiful sun-drenched landscapes. And in a way, I think this is the key to understanding Camus' philosophy of the absurd, which is often associated with the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre, but really, in fact, is a more nuanced evocation of older and sterner moral choices about life and death. In Camus' Algeria, God does not exist. Life is an endless series of moral choices which must be decided by individuals on their own, with no metaphysical comfort or advice, and with little or no possibility of knowing that they ever made the absolutely correct choice. And I think it's easy here to see how Camus' philosophy had a very direct appeal to the generation of French leftist intellectuals who fought in the Second World War, the period when occupied France was shrouded in moral ambiguity as well as in the military grip of the Germans. Camus' philosophy was less effective, however, in the post-war period, as Algerian nationalism began to assert itself against France, modelling itself on the values of the French resistance. Camus was sympathetic to the cause of Muslim rights. However, like most European Algerians on the left, Camus spoke no Arabic and had little patience with religion, including and especially Islam. Most importantly, through the 1950s, as the violence between the French and the Algerian nationalists intensified, Camus found himself endlessly compromised. His intentions were always noble, but by the time of his death in a car crash in 1960, he acknowledged that he no longer recognised the country of his birth. L'Algérie n'est plus. Moving forward, I always wanted to visit Algeria for years and years and years. And the period that I most intensely wanted to visit Algeria was during the 1990s. But this is when it was all but impossible to go to the country. Also, by now, reading Camus as a way into Algeria was simply a waste of time. In the 1990s, Algeria was a country dominated by terror. Algerian Muslims were regularly massacred by Islamist and other unknown forces. Foreigners were declared enemies by the Islamists targeted for execution. The government could not be trusted either. The only non-Algerians who braved the country were hardened war reporters. People like Robert Fisk, who described disguising his European face with a newspaper when travelling by car in Algiers, and staying no more than 4 minutes in a street or a shop. The minimum time, he decided, for kidnappers to spot a European. In Algiers, in the mid-1990s, in this most cosmopolitan of cities, less than an hour's flight away from the French mainland, for Algerians and Europeans, kidnap and murder were only ever a matter of minutes away. This is the reportage bit where it gets a little bit more personal. Right? This is a little bit of travelogue reportage. This is what I found when I arrived in Algiers for the first time a couple of years ago. In October 2009, in fact, when the city had yet to recover from terror, when the city was under curfew and roadblocks were everywhere, and it was a dangerous place to move around. Still, the city I found in 2009 was not quite the city of the 1990s. The ceasefire and the amnesty had been in place for a couple of years, although even in 2007 there had been a deadly wave of bombings and assassinations. And although you no longer had to hide your status as a European, and I am conspicuously European to most Algerians, the city was still very tense. I remember on the drive from the airport, I passed no less than 6 police or military checkpoints, all manned by heavily armed groups of men. It was getting dark and Algiers was emptying out for the night. During the long nightmares of the 1990s, nobody had actually dared to be out of doors after dark. And you could see that the habit still remained. As darkness fell, everybody left the city. And I remember as we drove against the rush hour traffic towards my hotel in the centre, you could see that along Marseille, Naples, Barcelona, Beirut, this was one of the great Mediterranean cities. In the dusk, you could still make out the pine forests of the surrounding hills and the magnificent dark blue sweep of the bay. Unlike any of their sister cities, however, maybe with the exception of Gaza, Algiers goes into lockdown at the first shadows of evening. Well, this is the first trip I made, and this went on for a couple of years, but over the first few days, the next few days, I crawled all over the city. I walked the boulevards, I climbed steep streets, I stared out at the sea from the heights, and I spoke to everybody I could, teachers, shopkeepers, students, journalists, political activists. One of the things that amazed me was that they were all remarkably frank. They were breathless and impatient to tell their stories to an outsider. The suffering during the years of Islamist terror had been incalculable. At lunch, an elegant university professor, a specialist in Marxism and feminism, told me how she went every day to classes at the university, driving past the headless corpses which were regularly pinned to the gates of the institute. A journalist who was gay, in fact, and you know, that was difficult as well, told me about the vicious paranoia of everyday life in Algiers in the 90s. And as he walked down the street, strangers, bearded young men who did not know him, would hiss at him and make a throat-slitting gesture. A female student who'd grown up in the so-called Triangle of Death, just outside Algiers, the small villages and suburbs which were then controlled by the GIA, the Group Islamique Armée, told me, I found this hard to listen to actually, a childhood memory of washing other people's blood off her feet, having waded through the muddy streets of her village after a massacre. And I remember this, that she told me these facts in a cold, steady voice, obviously distancing herself from the nightmare for the sake of self-preservation. Well, despite the horror stories, my exhilaration, and I was exhilarated, at first overcame fear. I'd waited a long time to be here. In the past 2 decades, I'd worked and travelled extensively in the Maghreb, in Morocco and Tunisia. But all the time, I've been dreaming of visiting Algeria, seeing Algiers, the capital of French North Africa. And most of all, this is where I began with Pepe Le Mocco. I needed to see the Casbah, the old Ottoman city which runs from the hills of Algiers down to the sea. Well, these days, the Casbah is in fact a rotting slum. Its narrow and ancient streets stink of sewage. There are gaping holes left by unfinished renovation projects or by unloved houses which have shattered and collapsed from neglect. Many of the inhabitants muttered that the authorities would like to see the complete destruction of the Casbah, which they see as a haven for criminals and terrorists. There's talk too of property speculators who want to build hotels and shops on prime real estate. But still, this has to be, in the French and the Algerian imagination, the most iconic and historically significant space in North Africa. And partly, this is what I discovered, that, well, go into a little bit of Freud. Walking down through Algiers from the Casbah is a very eerie experience. I did a creative writing workshop with the British Council, several workshops, with young Algerian students, Algiers students. And there was one word which kept coming up as we described the city, as we did these psycho-geographical exercises and these dérives and these ways of writing the city in the 21st century. And the one word that kept coming up was haunted. Whether it was in French, whether it was in English, whether it was in Arabic. It was a city of phantoms. But we've got to be careful here. This is not because the Casbah is a place where the usual European cliches about Arab or Ottoman cities function. And what I mean by this is that the long history of Orientalism has been to graft on to the Arab city a European notion of time or timelessness. So the Casbah, the Medina, is always medieval, it's always timeless, and therefore it's kind of imprisoned, it's kind of folklore rather than real history, and therefore it's neutered. You know, and if you go back to French representations of Algiers in the 1830s onwards, Delacroix and so on, you can see that the fantasy of the Casbah is an imprisoning of that reality. There's a more specific geographical reality, an urbanist reality as well, was that unlike Moroccan cities or Tunisian cities, where the Medina is separate to the European city, the Casbah is surrounded by boulevards which are based on the Haussmann boulevards of Paris. Very diagonal, long, very straight spaces. And what they look most like is the Rue de Rivoli in Paris. Now this is no accident, because the same architects and engineers who built the Rue de Rivoli in Paris in the 19th century were the same military architects and engineers who tried their plans out in Algiers before they moved them to Paris. And there's an interesting parenthesis that we can make. When we look at the 19th century, we see the invention of the concept of Le Vieux Paris, Old Paris. In the poems of Baudelaire, we find this nostalgia for the Paris of Villon, la forme d'une ville change plus vite, hélas que le cœur est mortel, that the old Paris is superior to the modernity of Haussmannized Paris. We can also see how Algiers functions as a trope in that way of thinking. That Algiers becomes, the Casbah of Algiers becomes a substitute for this concept of old Paris. And I don't think it's any accident this cross-cultural traffic happens in that way. Le Vieux Paris, the Casbah, are parallel forms of opposing the modernity of 19th century Paris for poets and artists. And what I mean to say by that, that these cliches are meaningless. They're meaningless because they're European notions of chronology, urban order and modernity, which, as I said before, have been grafted onto the living reality of 21st century Muslim life. And in fact, they're a way of politically neutering that real historical life. But back to the haunting, back to the ghosts. The sense of the uncanny, I think, that you meet during any trip to Algiers is classically Freudian. And it's Freudian in this sense, it's the dreamlike sense that without knowing it, you've already been here before. And this is true partly because of the myriad books, films and paintings about the city, which have, certainly made Algiers probably the most known, unvisited capital in the world. I'm sure anybody in this room who visits Algiers will feel, I've been here before, I've seen this place before. But it's also because, and this is the important point I think, that walking through Algiers is like walking through the wreckage of a recently abandoned civilization whose citizens have only just departed in a hurry, leaving behind their most personal possessions, which you immediately recognise. And I explain that. As you step down, this is the photograph here, the packed streets leading towards Place des Martyrs. And you can see in this photo the ruins of the French city begin to reveal themselves. As you go down past the Turkish-style mosque here, and as the city widens towards the sea, the arcades, passages and the streets are constructed with the geometric precision to be found in any French town. The centre of gravity of the French city was not outside the Casbah, it was here in the centre, between the Rue d'Isdi, which is now the Rue Ben Mehidi, and the Rue Michelet, which is now the Rue Tidouche Morad, the main artery of the city. So these streets may be named after the heroes of the war against the French, but Algiers is in fact, and I got this feeling more powerfully than any place I've been in the Maghreb, it's as purely French as Paris, Lyon or Bordeaux. And you see this in the details of the streets, in the street signs, the street lamps, the carefully constructed squares, the blue shuttered balconies, the old tram tracks, the cobbled paving stones. And at the dead centre of the city, on the boulevard Khamisti, is the Jardin de l'Horloge, a compact garden terrace which looks out directly onto the harbour, and with a monument to the French dead who gave their lives for Algérie Française has now been covered up. And if you stand in this place, a bit like Venice or like the port in Marseille, the passing ships seem so near that you can actually walk onto them. This is the point that I'm making. This is what this paper is about. It's about anything. This is the cityscape which is lodged deep in French cultural memory. It's the cityscape which persists in paintings, books, films as the very emblem of the city. One of the enduring images of this part of Algiers appears in Pepe Le Mocco. It's the photograph I showed before. I told you the story. Pepe, a Parisian gangster played by Jean Gabin, on the run from the prison police, holed up in the Casbah, falls in love with Gabi, a young Parisian tourist, who evokes him along for Paris. He's abandoned and he's imprisoned in the Casbah, imprisoned in Algiers. In the final scene of the film, which is what I showed before, Pepe risks capture by the police by leaving the Casbah and running all the way down into the French city in the port, down to the ship where Gabi's embarked to return to France. He's arrested and led away. I'm very romantic, I'm getting carried away myself here. In a final gesture of love for Gabi and the Paris he represents, he calls out to her, pushes against the steel gates that he cannot pass. And as Pepe calls out to his lover, she cannot hear him. In frustration, Pepe takes out a pocket knife and stabs himself in the heart. And that's the final scene. Pepe's corpse stretched on the gates, which have kept him in Algeria and cut him off from the ship, which then we see bound for France. And the drama is heightened all the more as it's set across the backdrop of the French city and the Casbah, two worlds locked in mutual antagonism. This is the real point. In any other circumstances, Algiers would be called by French historians a lieu de mémoire, a place of memory. I'm sure you know about this anyway. This is a theory of history dear to many contemporary French historians, which deciphers historical meaning not only from books and archives, but also geographical sites. And Pierre Nora set this in motion in the 1980s. The work is ongoing. But it goes like this: the landscape of France, from this point of view, from the Chateau of the Loire to the battlefields of the First World War, can all be read by the historian as a complete text, a text which has been memorialised and made legible to the present. My view is this, that the trauma of Algerian history and the trauma of the Algerian present cannot yet be classified in this way. When you go into the city for the first time, you notice that the bay is dominated by the Monument aux Martyrs. This is this picture here. A brutal concrete sculpture on one of the heights of Algiers. It is shaped, surely an accident, like a huge gallows. It's meant to commemorate those Algerians who gave their lives for independence. But the ugliness, I think, of this, the Monument aux Martyrs, is in fact terrifying. But I also think this is why it's such a suitable emblem for a city and a country, that word again, haunted by past and present fears. And that is why, instead of being a lieu de mémoire, Algiers is in fact a site of impossible mourning for both French and Algerians. So, I don't have a conclusion, because this is the opening part of the section of the book which moves towards a conclusion. This is the opening. This is not a conclusion. This is the beginning. And it's like this, that I think it's over 70 years since Pepe killed himself at the harbour gates to France. And in the 21st century, for the present generation of young Algerians who cannot get visas to leave the country, to leave the unemployment and the poverty, Algiers feels like an open prison. The impassable sea is still a wall. And for countless generations of Algerians, it has in fact been this way since the first battle between France and Algeria nearly 200 years ago. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much. I forgot to ask you at the beginning, you will take some questions.
Oh, that was the point. Yeah, that's why I left
yeah.
straight. Yeah.
Fantastic. Questions to Andrew, please. Who would like to start us off? Yes, please.
Jan Gerda from the University of Estonia. If you compare, for example, relations between France and Algiers and between Great Britain and Egypt, for example, what would be the first keywords that come into your head?
Well, historically speaking, I suppose rivalry, because one of the reasons that the French coveted Algeria so much was because of the British presence in Egypt. And of course, Napoleon's failed adventure there. But I don't think the relationship is in any way parallel, given the strange complicity and intimacy between the French nation, the French people, and Algiers. And what I mean by that is that through the 19th century, this is partly to do with legal manoeuvres, but also partly to do with cultural manoeuvres. Algeria was not a colony, it was in fact an integral part of France, with the same status as Alsace or any département. And that created this strange double bind for the Muslim population, in which to be a French citizen you had to be an apostate Muslim, which was impossible. And so therefore you created a country in which there were two parallel but not equal relationships. So effectively, I think what happens in Algeria throughout the 19th century is a creation, if I want to use a different metaphor, of a dysfunctional family rather than a colony.
Other questions and comments? Yes, please.
Yes, two questions. I'm not sure if I've clarified in my mind. I'm from Goldsmiths, by the way. The first of all would be, it seems to me that in talking of psychology, the trauma associated with Algeria seems to be of a certain generation of French who were involved in the Algerian War, and their failure to sort of come to terms with that. So I've been to a couple of seminars where there's this kind of abstract denial of France in any way being involved in the sort of the kind of horrific events of colonialism. And there seems to be trauma there, seems to be affecting a relationship. The other side of it would be that I think there's never a danger of essentialising France versus Algeria insofar as for a younger generation of French who are very much kind of sort of a mixture of Arab and French culture. You know, for example, in the film La Haine, where one sees maybe not Algerian, but there is a sort of a much more kind of mestizo, Creole French identity. Now I wonder whether you can essentialise that across those two terms.
I can go along with that, but take the second point. I think La Haine is a complete fairy tale. I really don't believe in that at all. And I really don't believe what is recounted in the film, that a black, an Arab and a Jew would all be friends in the banlieue. And I would corroborate that with a piece I did. It's just come out in the new Granta Book of Travel, actually, but I did about 2 years ago. I investigated the killing of a young Jewish guy called Ilan Halimi in the banlieue of Bagneux. And this was conducted by, well, it wasn't conducted, it was led by a group of black supremacists called the Tribucat, and a group called les Barbars who were around all of that. And one of the things that I found most shocking about that, and this is not the worst of the banlieue, was that on the ground, the prevailing code amongst young disaffected men, young men in the banlieue, was a kind of anti-Semitism that bound them all together. And I found that interesting because I'm interested in violence, as I said before. And this seemed to me to be parallel to the late 19th century and the rise of anti-Semitism in France as one class disintegrates, the petit bourgeois class disintegrates and has this sense of unreality. One way of defining it, it's new realities through anti-Semitism. And I was making a parallel here between someone like Céline, a writer I admire greatly, but who was basically a Nazi collaborator, and this prevailing code, which was the binding force in the Bonnier. So this essentialising of France, I'm spinning that on its head, and you may not agree with this, but I think that the rainbow generation of Zidane, of 1997, I think that was the essentialised myth, and that the reality is something else. I can also add to that as well, that somebody I spent a fair amount of time interviewing with Zidane himself, and you know that Zidane has been accused of being a traitor, and one of the great insults is Zidane Aki, and all of that kind of stuff. Zidane's a hard nut, he knows about these things. And you know, we talk about, he himself never believed in those myths at all, as someone at the focus of those things. So, without being too provocateur about it, I do sense that there's a lot of wishful thinking on the left, of which I'm a member, which doesn't match the reality on the ground.
I love the idea that Zidane is a hard nut. Yeah. He did demonstrate that he could do that very well. But I wanted to follow up on the Britain-Egypt, France-Algeria question, because as you were talking, and as you know, when everyone thinks about France's relationship with its colonies and its former colonies, it is such a different history, or it appears to be, or it's narrated in such a different way as the history between Britain and its colonies, and the fact that that all French colonies were part of France, at least juridically they were part of France. But even more powerfully, the fact that, and here, you know, and Philip's in the room, and maybe we want to gloss what I'm saying or even disagree with it, but the peculiar, the distinctive issue about Algeria and France in terms of that is so different from Britain is that what happens in Algeria tears apart France. And I'm not aware that what happened elsewhere, happened in any of the British colonies, tore apart Britain. Even some of the the most violent in East Africa and so on, didn't have that effect at home. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And that seems to be the huge contrast, that for France, what goes on in its colonies, certainly what goes on in one of its colonies, it gets to the heart of French politics and cultural life and so on, in a very painful way.
You might even say that story is not over.
No.
And that's where we're going to answering that question today. I mean, it's interesting when the first insurrection is launched in Sétif, and that was, what was that, VE Day in Europe? And it's, you know, this is a huge sort of massacre. And it's completely overlooked by de Gaulle. It's just a footnote in history that rises up and overwhelms France in the 1950s.
But the question is why there is this difference, and it can't just be the juridical issue. It definitely isn't that. But is it that actually the movement of people, backwards and forward, there isn't the equivalent of the Pied Noir?
There's the equivalent of that intimacy and that complicity, the nearness, if you like. And also, as well, the fact that, you know, during the 19th century, Algeria was flooded, not just with French people, but with Europeans. And they were often working class, they were often prisoners, the Mediterranean was like a big sort of prison ship at that time. Camus' background was working class, Spanish, and the sheer force of numbers, as well as the cultural class nature of that population, I think created all of those tensions.
So a final thought then, that suddenly occurred to me, in the sense Britain has a love affair with India. It's very easy to have that love affair with India, in culture, in film, in books and so on. Much, much harder for the French to have that simple and idealised relationship with Algeria.
I would agree with that, and I you know, I've been in Paris for 6 years and working on this, and it seems that everybody's got an Algeria story, for good or bad. You know, my family were in Algeria, my dad was in Algeria, so-and-so was in the army, whatever. You scrape away at the surface, and it's part of the cultural DNA of what is France now. There's no easy answers, but it's not the same relationship at all.
Bill, you want to follow that?
Yeah, it was just actually just another attempt to answer Jeff's question of the comparison, and it's already been alluded to that the role of the Second World War is completely different between British and French history. that the Second World War was a French civil war as well, and all those issues of the far left, far right, and so on played themselves out. Whereas within Britain, the Second World War was able to become a kind of refounding of the British national narrative around the supposed unanimity of the Blitz and so on, and therefore also partly erased the empire and colonialism as crucial parts of the narrative. So that in some ways, for Britain, the Second World War kind of redeems colonialism, and therefore enables certain misunderstandings and underestimations of some of the violence you were alluding to. None of that is available to France, and on the contrary, one of the ways in which French elites try to react to the catastrophe of occupation and so on is to hold on to the empire, very mistakenly, obviously, and by mistaken ideas of the Republic and so on and so forth. So I think that, for me, that would be a very important factor as well in understanding these differences and the wrenching violence that was involved, certainly in Algeria.
But that was a starting point. But the story is as I suggested before, the thing is, it's defining factor where France is now in the 21st century, actually.
Other comments, please? Yes, Katja, sorry.
Yes,
yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned Gilles Pontecorvo's was Battles of Algiers, which was very important. I was wondering how, if at all, this iconic film, this iconic epic of feeds into your Waltz of Algiers.
Well, I think it's a great film, and I first watched it 20 years ago, and it sort of set you on with Camus and all that kind of thing, set you on the path to all of those things. But I'm still not sure. I think it's a brilliant film, and I'm still not sure that I believe it. Or if you like, I'm not sure that I want to believe what it's telling me. And in a way, when I said it's dated before, I think lovely, brilliant, masterful film as it is, it's as dated as the Black Panthers hanging out in Algiers in 1969. It's the wishful thinking.
Deeply influential.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And very important. But not always in a positive way. I mean, but as I say, I mean, my view on it is I feel about the Algerian students, and they love it, right? And they all want to join the FLN, right? Because it's exciting as well, right? It's sticking it to the man. But it's more complex than that, because it's part of a moment in history. And there's also questions to ask about the Battle of Algiers. Did it really reflect what was going on in Algiers at that point in history? Or did it reflect the wishful thinking of European leftists?
Please.
I wanted to ask about your choice of film for the 21st century, which was DS Polymer, and how you read that in gender terms. I mean, you've moved from Papilemoko to DS Polymer, white male, to Arab female. And is it something to do with the feminization of the city, or is that important? Is gender issues important?
There's definitely gender issues involved in it. I suppose you've got to look at the position of Biouna, and I'm not being crass about this. She's always on Algerian telly. She's very funny, she's very witty, and she's not unlike a kind of Algerian Cilla Black, actually. The sort of witty, mumsy vixen of French Algerian culture. Do you know what I think is important about that film is that women are at the forefront of it, they're in charge of it, but they're also incredibly funny as well. And after the black years of terror, I think it's quite a brave thing actually to start producing some romantic comedies out of that city. I don't know what that tells us, but it tells us that some kind of renaissance has to be happening.
Miles and then Philip. Miles.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you very much for a wonderfully stimulating, colourful paper. I'm just going to rephrase the question I asked you before you began, which is if there had been an Arab Spring in Algeria, would Sarkozy's reaction have been as gung-ho as it was in Libya?
Well, do you know, that is a really penetrating question that I will answer, but I won't answer with any of the authority of my friends at the embassy who are closer to the Élysée Palace than I am. I was in Algeria in this summer, and what I was told by highly placed intelligence people, effectively, was that the Arab Spring will not happen in Algeria. And it will not happen in Algeria for this reason, for two reasons. One is that ordinary Algerians are still terrified of the chaos of the 1990s. And secondly, the pouvoir are still, tightly in control of what is happening. What I found on the ground, and I didn't have any great insight into what was happening other than what my mind has allowed me to see, was a lot of anger. There were a lot of police outside the mosques, there was a lot of Islamist rhetoric, and so that perhaps the terror of the return to the 1990s was a real phenomenon. I really don't know. I've been commissioned by the FT to go back to Algeria in a month or two to actually answer that question, and perhaps when I've done a more comprehensive job, I'll be able to answer it for you, because I think it's a question everyone would like an answer to. But all I can report is what I saw, which was that liberalisation is not happening in Algeria, but nor is anything like revolution.
Philip, did you have?
Yeah, I mean, I just goes back a bit, and it was going back to Jeff's use of the term love affair. It just reminded me how kind of complicated and tempestuous love affairs can sometimes be. And if there was a British love affair with India, it was certainly unrequited in the post-war period. I mean, there was a fairly definite break. And I think in terms of the comparison, one of the most striking things to a sort of historian of British decolonisation is how quickly after that bloodbath of the Algerian Civil War, France re-established a very close relationship with Algeria. In some ways closer than the relationship that Britain subsequently maintained, with countries where there had been a far more peaceful and amicable transfer of power. And I think this is one of the most interesting things in terms of that comparison. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
I'd say to make some of I think the love affair is not just a metaphor, it's a real phenomenon, and the tempestuous, volatile, love-hate relationship is what defines that relationship. And I think it's interesting that after 1962, there's the big movement of Pied Noir back to Algeria. So Algiers fantasises this third world utopia. But there's also details that people who left want to come back because they like food, or the sunshine, or the buildings, or they feel part of it, that it's part of them. And there's a third identity, isn't there, which is the Pied Noir identity, Algérien, nous sommes équipes, which is, something which goes back over 150 years. So that love affair is also a self-love and being part of, if you like, a family. And I think that it's the family problems that politics can't explain, I think. And I think now, I think prisoners of love, that metaphor. Algiers now is full of young people who desperately want to get to France, even though they hate it. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Take one last question, please.
I just wanted to ask a question about French language and culture, and I saw a film the other day called Monteligne about school in the banlieue, and I was interested to know what your thoughts are on Algerian vocabulary and French language from Algeria and culture coming across into France, and whether or not this influencing the people.
Well, I'm not a linguistician, right? But you can't live in Paris without listening to the music of the city. And the second language of Paris is not classical Arabic, it's Darija, which is Arabic of North Africa. But then there's a way in which there's a lot of people, well, how does this work? In the banlieue, there is a distinct reaction amongst kids, basically, of all races and classes, against classical Parisian French. Not just posh French, but actually the Parigot accent that you would hear on someone like Jean Gabin, which is sort of the equivalent of Cockney, which is effectively now died out. It doesn't really exist. It's all this kind of, it doesn't really exist anymore. But there's also a reaction against the centre and the periphery. And the Parisian accent of the centre represents a certain class, race identity, which I did some work with football hooligans up at PSG. It was interesting that they were split between banlieusards, Arab immigrants, and white working class Parisians, and there was a linguistic divide. the pronunciation of certain words, the use of certain slang. And one of the ways into it is you get along with a lot of young Arab kids in the banlieue who don't speak Arabic at all, but they'll use certain words from that they think are Arabic, or these use certain expressions, or they'll transliterate them into French, mon frère, you know. And it's all about speaking a code and saying this is who we are because we're not you. You know, and I think that's interesting. I think the white working class reaction to that is interesting as well. I'll probably finish with this, right? I've been doing a lot of work in prisons recently. I've been visiting French prisons. And the final chapter of this book is going to be in French prisons. It's not going to be in the Maghreb, because I think the engine room of radicalism in France probably is the French prison system. And it's interesting that the majority of prisoners are Muslims, and the majority of the Muslims are Algerians. But in France, you're not allowed to recognise either of those identities. But the most powerful Islamist radical in France is a guy called Lionel Dumont, who's white, working class, and from the town of Roubaix, who in the 90s got involved with the Mujahideen in Bosnia, got involved with Al-Qaeda in France, and is now serving a life sentence for various plaquage and terrorist acts. And the director of prisons, who I know quite well, seems to regard Dumont, and so do the other guards as well, with a kind of almost homoerotic awe. He's like a sort of Genet figure with this massive physical presence. He was a paratrooper. He doesn't really speak Arabic, but he speaks enough to sound really good. And the press know him as the Ch'ti, Islamiste. Ch'ti, as you probably know, is the northern working class Frenchman. It's like the Islamist Scouser or something like that. But it just seems to be interesting that you spin this around, and it's not about Islam, it's not even about colonisation, it's about something to do with the very nature of the French system, which seems to produce these extremist ways of behaving.
Andrew, you will have heard what I hope was very much at one point towards the end of your talk, the sound of glasses and bottles being trundled along the corridor and hopefully ending up in the room at the back there, so that we can join you for a drink and some informal conversation. But before we do that, could I ask Professor Bill Marshall, who's the director of the Institute of Germanic and Romance Studies, just to say a few words of thanks on behalf of us all. Bill.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll stand at the front for this. My task is even more difficult because I know that everyone is anticipating a drink, so that makes it hard. But I think the richness of the discussion has paid tribute to the richness of both the material you're discussing and the paper itself, because it's obviously connected with a lot of different disciplines that are represented in the room. I just thought I might make three very brief points, if I may. And the first two really arise from the film clip that you showed, because I also, like Carrie, was very struck by that marvellous scene in People in Moko, the description of the Casbah. Is extraordinary for me for two reasons. One is that amidst that cosmopolitanism and that kind of litany of different ethnic groups, Arab Algerians are in fact absent. So there's this kind of utter denial of Arab nationalism as such. But what's also striking is that one gets the sense in that vision of Algiers, and also the kind of lost Algiers that you were alluding to in the reality of the late 20th century and early 21st century, is a kind of missed opportunity for hybridity, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, and so on. And that absence of, and that difficulty of dealing with hybridity is something which affects both metropolitan France and the offshoot of metropolitan France, I can put it that way, the kind of mirror image that attempted to negate metropolitan France, which was Algerian nationalism. And we see in Algiers today, which has lost that element. But also just in terms of there's been quite a lot about sex and sexuality in your talk. Perhaps sometimes underneath the surface and sometimes not. I mean, you were talking about the homoeroticism vis-a-vis this prisoner, and various other kind of erotic and sexual themes have been there. And obviously the portrayal of the Casbah in that scene is very erotic, very feminized, as Carrie was saying, these dank corners and so on and so forth. So in other words, the idea of the Casbah is different. It's also very marked by anxieties around sexual difference as well, which I think is perhaps a common thread in a lot of the things you were saying. And we know that both Camus and Fanon, in their very different ways, have their blind spots about sexual difference. And my third point is just a very general one. It's just about this business of walls. As these metaphors tend to do, they also begin to suggest other possible metaphors. The metaphor I had in my mind was membrane rather than wall. A membrane which is both a division, also something that is crossed, and sometimes crossed in mysterious and secret ways. So I think a lot of your talk was also about interconnections. And it's very interesting to take examples of cities rather than kind of whole nations, as it were, because it's sometimes easier to track these surprising lateral connections between places in that way. Just as a quick footnote to that, there's a district in New Orleans which is called Algiers. There's a whole history there of interconnection and so on, of interconnecting membranes, which we might want to talk about. And on the subject of membranes then, again, this idea of kind of interconnections, I'm tempted to say in the nicest possible way about, just return to your point at the beginning about your role in ULIP within French culture, the French context, the French Academy, that we might see you, Andrew, and indeed ULIP as a kind of virus. That you are there, and perhaps elements of you are flowing across the membranes into other particles or organisms, both in France and the rest of continental Europe. And I think obviously we here at School of Advanced Study, we very much want to share your viral reality. Thank you very much for your very nice talk.